It's a great pleasure to be here. Really enjoyed the one session that I've been in. When I was in politics, I could have done with a laughing session, but I didn't go to that today. Jill McFadden, it's great to catch up with you again. Jill and I met in the early 1990s when I was Premier, and I was doing the kissing babies job, and her baby was one of the ones I kissed. Still alive, I hope. And members of the association and board and colleagues. May I first acknowledge the Kaurna people and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and any here today. Thank you for your kind invitation to be here. I was delighted to come anyway because I have 2 grandchildren here, and they're always great to visit, although I'm always exhausted at the end of it because they're still young. And even though they beg for court power, they are still quite nice kids. But they were very impressed when I arrived this time. They're usually impressed when I arrive, but this time they were very impressed. Because I got into the plane and I sat down, and there's this gorgeous looking blonde sitting next to me, young, Gen Y certainly, and she had her leather boots up on the front of the plane dash there, and I thought, well, this will be an interesting trip. I had no idea who she was, and she had no idea who I was, so that was even. And right behind me, there are all these other gorgeous young women in long boots and short back skirts, or they all look like cats. I sort of know they were, right? Anyway, can you guess who they were? Pussycat dolls, yes. When I told my granddaughter I was in the same plane as the Pussycat dolls, she said, "Did you know who they were, Nana?" No, of course not. And then, but I really cracked it because I had a ticket that was signed by the young woman I was sitting next to, who was Lady Gaga. I now know who she is. I now know how old she is. I know now she's got a mum. And she comes from New York, and she thinks Obama is fantastic. So that was our joint conversation about Obama. But what was really interesting was the question she asked me was, and what do you do? You know, we tend to ask that question, don't we, if anyone? What do you do? And I said, oh, I used to be in politics. I was Premier of Victoria, and then I realised there was a blank book, so I said, well, you call it governor. Oh, wow, she said, you were a governor? I said, yes. And she said, what is it like being a woman governor? I said, well, what's it like being a woman singer? And she said, tough. And I said, just the same. So from then on, we hit it off. And one thing she said to me was, you know, Joan, but on first name terms by this. You know, Joan, she said, I've got to the age, and she should have been all but 25, I've got to the age that I don't really care too much what people think about me or say about me, as long as they know that I'm here to make a difference. And I thought, wow, that's hardly Gen Y, but anyway. And I said, well, that's funny, because it took me till I was 45, to actually decide that I didn't care too much what people said about me, but the thing I really cared about was whether they knew what I stood for. And so we agreed we were both very deep-thinking people, likely to make a difference. So it was a great experience, really. And of course, I'm now very much up there in my granddaughter's eyes, so that's excellent too. But I thought it was actually quite appropriate to this fantastic group and the work you do and those who are not here, because you do have to care about what people think about you, or they obviously wouldn't come to your centre. But the really important thing is what you stand for. And I think you have a bit of a challenge in South Australia to get the powers that be to realise what you stand for and how much you contribute. And there's no use feeling sorry for yourself about that. You just have to get on and change it. So that's what I want to talk about, really. I'm not going to talk about leadership as a theory. I'm going to talk about leadership as a practice. So let me start with where I started, really. I started in neighbourhood houses in the early 70s. The early 70s. I was just talking to Michael here and Michael Cowling, and he was talking about being at Park School when it was closed. And I was actually in the Schools Commission in the 70s and working in the Disadvantaged Schools program. So it's an interesting connection. And you wonder how any government could close a school of 350 in a disadvantaged area. Just appalling. So clearly that community either didn't have any clout or wasn't in the framework of thinking of that particular government. So that's another example of how important it is not only to be effective in what you do, but to get into the government's framework of thinking. And there is no better time to do it than in the year leading up to an election year. Now, as I said, I've had the pleasure of being involved in neighbourhood houses for 40 years. I say that quickly, for 40 years. And I was a young mum, living out in the outer east of Melbourne, with a lot of other young mums around me, and we had lots of kids and no footpaths. And I met two outstanding women. One was Gwen Lisson from Diamond Valley Neighbourhood House, the first one in Victoria, and one of the first in Australia. And she wrote a book called Brian's Wife and Jenny's Mum, which is about how women tended to see themselves, or certainly other people tended to see it in those days, as only that. That was important, but you're not only that. And I met another woman called Phil Slattery. She was Blackburn Neighbourhood House, or the Avenue as they call themselves. Now they inspired me and many other women to become part of the neighbourhood house movement. Gwen was a quiet community builder, but very determined and very philosophical. She'd read all the Germaine Greers and Simone de Beauvoir's, etc., before your time for most of you, but she'd read them all, and she wanted the chance for women to grow. And she focused in her house, or the house as they called it, on education and training. And at the time the Whitlam government was opening up education for second chance education. Phil was a community activist, and boy was she a community activist. And I've met a few here today, so very similar to Karen and others. And she was determined to see neighbourhood houses not just as little houses for little women, as some of the blokes tended to see it. Although one of them asked me once, what did we get up to in our neighbourhood houses? What do you get up to in your neighbourhood houses? And I said, well, we get up to what women in those houses, as they were mainly those days, pleased to say there are men in them now as well, we get up to what the women themselves need. And how do you know that, he said? And I said, well, because when they come to our house, they're comfortable enough to state out what they need. They don't feel put off. They're comfortable enough to say so. The other thing Phil taught us was the strategic importance of networking. I would go as far as to say that a neighbourhood house movement is as strong as its network. If you don't have a strong network, you don't have a strong neighbourhood house movement. So from 1982 to 1992, there were a number of women elected to Parliament in Victoria who were already connected with neighbourhood houses, 4 ministers in fact, and very supportive of the movement. But of course, you should have seen the blank faces on some of the male ministers who didn't know what a neighbourhood house was. Nevertheless, the idea and concept began to get through. But we were still doing it on the cheap, were we not, Jill? We were doing it on the cheap. In the 1990s, the women who'd been working in neighbourhood houses for some 10 years experienced a change of government and decided it was their turn not only to fight to survive, but to fight to grow and to be adequately funded. And they built good links between many of the neighbourhood houses and their local members of parliament. But then we lost government and Joan Kirner arrived. And though he was good at some things, like taking the Grand Prix off South Australia, and as far as I'm concerned, you could have kept it. But anyway, I wasn't Premier by then. But his view of advocacy and community participation was not exactly encouraging, and there was another fight for survival. And neighbourhood houses did fight, and they did survive just. In the build-up to the 1999 elections, when Labor just scraped in, the ANLHC saw their opportunity, that's what you'd call your board, saw the opportunity, excuse me, to saw the opportunity to go for some better funding. And they did. But they didn't do too well because they didn't have a campaign behind them. They had a request behind them, but not a campaign. So they asked for, in that campaign, in that request, $6 million extra over 3 years. It's not much really, given, well, now we've got 395 neighbourhood houses in Victoria, and then we had about 320. So it wasn't much, but it was at least an acknowledgement that we were there and we were asking. So when we got that promise, we thought, there's the step, there's the foot in the door. We can build on that. And we did. And the really great thing that happened was the Victorian government decided that it should set up a Department of Victorian Communities, and that as well as having an economic strategy and an environmental strategy, it would have a community building strategy, which it called Fairer Victoria. Again, at the time, there was a fantastic CEO of ANHLC Victoria, and her name was Muriel Clark, and she seized the moment to effect change with all the neighbourhood houses in Victoria. I can't emphasise that too much. It is not the job of your board to get more money for neighbourhood houses. It is your job. If you value what you're doing and the community values what you're doing, then you've got to go out and get the money that demonstrates your value. Do you agree with me? Yes. Come on, a bit more than that. Do you agree with me? Yes. Okay, well, you've got to mean this. I want to talk about steps to power now. These are the ones that worked in Victoria. You will have to vary them, I guess, to work for you in South Australia. First of all, you need to have a working party that is driving it, and I understand your board's doing that. What is it that you're trying to do? What is your essential purpose? Is your essential purpose to demonstrate that you're doing a good job? Or is your essential purpose to demonstrate that as you are doing a good job, your people who you work with are an essential piece of community building, which is in government policy, and therefore it is in the government's interest as well as the community's interest to invest in what you do. Do you see yourself as an investment?
Yes.
You do? You see yourself as a government investment?
Yep.
Investment in what? What are you asking them to invest in?
Improving the health of the
Community? Building a community. How many times does the government use that when they speak? Building community, all the time. Who's the best community builders? neighbourhood houses. You are. We are. So get your purpose very clear. You will not win a campaign by simply saying how good you are. Sure, it is important to demonstrate that. Demonstrate it with your cards, demonstrate it wherever you go, invite people to visit, but be clear that you're not there being little women in little houses or little men in little houses. You are there as an essential piece of community infrastructure, without which the community is poorer and with which the community is stronger. So, when I say we, I don't mean myself personally, but the Future Directions Working Party had established its purpose, then of course it had to build on that purpose with a case for a budget submission and more funds, capital and recurrent. Don't be fobbed off to just recurrent or just capital. You need money for growth here, new neighbourhood houses or neighbourhood houses in areas where you don't have them, or where you do have them and there's no recurrent funding. I know your funding system's a bit different, but the general point remains. So that's the first step. Second step is to get your government to do some work. And what we actually did, and we were very lucky, I must say, is our new Department of Victorian Communities decided it was going to concentrate on community building. So what did we say? Have we got a partnership for you? If you want to build communities, we can work with you to show you how to do it, or to enhance what you do and enhance what we do. So we did a budget submission for 2005. We asked for an extra $26 million. Now my middle son's in the union movement and he would describe that as an ambit claim. Well, it was. But that doesn't matter. You always put in a claim about twice as much as you're actually going to get. But don't tell anybody that's what you're doing. They will have already worked it out. So we asked for an extra 26 million, made up of 16 million recurrent and 10 million capital over 4 years. And then we began networking with the department, with all the other agencies with whom you're connected, and many of them are here today, with ACFI, as we call it, I think you call it ACE, and then anyone that we thought would be useful. And then we talked to the minister at the time, Cheryl Garvin, a very supportive minister, and she said, look, your good intentions, your purpose, they're fine, but Treasury are a tough mob, and really what she's arguing with is Treasury. No experience in neighbourhood houses, probably still thinks we're all still basket weavers. And that's what they used to call me. I've never woven a basket in my life. But you've got to give me the base, she said. You've got to give me the research on the cost benefit of neighbourhood houses. And I understand from Jill that New Zealand's just done some good work on that. You know, that's what they do in budgets. They now analyse the cost benefit financially, and I'll come to the political one in a moment. So we did that, and we asked Sue West at RMIT, Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, to do the work, and I suggest you ask somebody like Ms. Verity to do the work. We then organised our greatest resource. What was our greatest resource?
Your users.
People, the youth, the people in their neighbourhood houses. Not just your coordinator, who of course is crucial to it, but all the people you're in contact with. Every one of them needs a postcard. Every one of them needs to write one line about why the neighbourhood house is important to them, or what's changed, or how you struggle. Something that you can put into your campaign book so that you've got these very good lines. It was very interesting. I mean, I spend a lot of time as Victorian Communities Ambassador out in neighbourhood houses or communities now. And one of the best things I've ever heard said to me by one woman whose neighbourhood house I visited, which is also part of a community action program, she said to me, I said, what's the difference between when you had this neighbourhood house and before. And she said, before the neighbourhood house, I was just a taxpayer. Now I'm a citizen. Now you can't have a better example of how neighbourhood houses make a difference than that. So the key point that I want to make to you today is the central success story for Victoria, and I haven't come to the amount we've got yet, is lobbying by neighbourhood house members and friends. Lobbying every MP for greater recognition for the work neighbourhood houses do and for support. That was our essential game plan, and there's no replacement for it. How many, put your hands up if you have regular conversations with your local member? Not good enough. You can see I was a teacher. I wanted everybody's hands up. But you'll get there, and you must get there. And then you need some pizzazz, you know, something, because, you know, MPs get lobbied all the time, newspapers get stories all the time. You need some pizzazz, and I understand you've got some pizzazz lined up, like crackers and other things. Anyway, I won't talk about that because that's got to be a surprise. But you do need some life, and you do need some numbers. We had a Save the Heart of Our Community campaign. We had heart badges for neighbourhood houses, and along with the normal one. And we had a mothers and children's walk. They all loved babies and pushes to Treasury Gardens, and a rally in those gardens. And of course, those gardens, if you know Melbourne, are overlooked by the Premier and the Treasurer's office. So that was quite handy. Do use your local newspapers. Local MPs use their local newspapers all the time. You need to get your good stories, not just your begging bowl stories, your good stories about the changes you're making in neighbourhood houses into your local newspapers. And don't sit there thinking you're too exhausted to do all this, because I tell you what, you won't survive unless you do some of them. You don't have much choice. The funding that you are getting in neighbourhood houses, generally, not all, here, is not adequate for you to meet the demand. I'll tell you that, you know that. And it is also very exhausting not to have full-time workers or the equivalent of full-time workers in your house for both the community and the workers. The other thing that happened was that the government itself, as we were pressuring them, realised, the department realised that they needed to do some cost-benefit analysis. And you know, when they did that, they found that neighbourhood houses were one of the cheapest ways. Fancy that. They found it was one of the cheapest ways to do the community connection they were saying was so vital to social inclusion. So we set our targets, and this time we didn't ask for 26 million, we asked for 44 million over 4 years. Now do remember that we've got 395 houses, but that was just under double. We asked for increased funding for average house hours for every house of 35 hours per coordinator. Houses to be open for 5 days a week, if they weren't all open 5 days a week. Networks, I don't know whether you have a network coordinators scheme, but anyway, we do, and it's pretty effective. I know you have networks, regional networks. We wanted them funded for 5 days a week, and we wanted the state organisation to be funded for 3 effective full-time positions. So we were nothing if not visionary, shall we say, and cheeky. They were big aims, they were well argued, they were well reinforced with research, and of course we knew they were an aim at the claim, but they were so well researched and so heavily lobbied that the government in an election year knew they had to take us seriously. So we obtained at least government recognition initially for our determination. They knew we weren't going to go away. There's no way we were going to go away. And as soon as one door was shut, we just opened another one. Because there are always politicians and there are always government people, and certainly what yours called SACOS, isn't it? There are always people in SACOS who can open another door for you. But the most important thing we did in terms of our argument, other than demonstrating the cost benefit, was to link with the government's policy. They said they were serious about community building, and that for community building they needed infrastructure and grants, of course. But we argued that it wasn't sufficient to have all these little grants that you get for fruit, veg or whatever. They're important. But how can you do all this without a central coordinating person to give the community the coordinating strength they needed to keep supporting their broader community? And slowly but surely that argument came through. Now we were very careful, by the way, to use proper neighbourhood house principles in the way we operate. We operated claiming the work of neighbourhood houses as centres for local community building or strengthening or development. We encouraged the participation of all the people in the sector, from the board to the people attending classes. We encouraged the participation of interested and sympathetic people across the state, like artists, for example, who worked in neighbourhood centres. We drew on the commitment and passion that neighbourhood house participants feel for their work and their communities. It's often best when you go, every area, every neighbourhood house asks to visit their MP, not once, not twice, but about 3 times in the year. And it was very useful to take to those meetings, train them up a bit, people who'd never been to meet an MP before. Don't tell them what to say, just encourage them to be confident enough to say it, and you'll find that they cut through. You know, those of us who used to go into meetings don't always cut through. We kind of think about, what will the minister think about us, or this or other. If you get a passionate neighbourhood houser who's never been to see an MP before, just wanting to say how it's made a difference to them, you will cut through in the discussion. And if you don't cut through the first time, you go back the second time. Take notes. Make sure you take notes of everything the member or the minister says and what they promised and they haven't delivered in the 2 months following, or even 1 month. Then write back and say, where was that letter you're going to send us? Encourage people to work together. Say you've got 4 neighbourhood houses in your local government area or in the electorate, then make sure they're all saying similar things. And then the centre is very important, because the bullets are made very often, they're fired by the lobbying group, but they're made very often by the research work that the centre has done. And if you as a neighbourhood house have hit upon a good lobbying strategy, then share it with others. And at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is not simply fund neighbourhood houses. What you're trying to do is empower the communities within which you work to be able to make their claim on government for their share of funding. It's really strange. In the 40 years I've been active in the community, I still have people saying to me, this is 45 now, I still have people saying to me, oh, I don't want to be political. And they're in neighbourhood houses. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean? It means you don't want to use the power you have? Or does it mean you don't have any power? Or it means you don't want to go into Parliament? Well, I don't care whether you want to go into Parliament or not, but I do care whether you are standing up for the right of your community to be properly funded by government for community building. And when it is, then you can go on and take the next step. The other key campaign strategies are really attached to the future. It's really important when you have a campaign to get more money from a budget submission, It's really important not to see that as the end, because you'll go backwards if you do. So this is part of an ongoing campaign. Remember to say thank you for what you get. That's very important. But, and to say thank you publicly, but remember that there's the next step and the next step. And we added issues like this. Our first campaign strategy, as you know, was to involve and mobilise houses and centres to lobby. Our second was to be clear about the outcome. And we were so fortunate because we had as a minister by then a young woman who knew about neighbourhood houses and had worked on those issues because she'd been my senior advisor as Premier. And she was, not because she was my senior advisor, but because she was committed. She understood the importance of neighbourhood houses in community building. She, after we'd done all this lobbying, she announced a $27.8 million increase over what we had before, the 24 million, over 4 years as the recurrent funding for the neighbourhood house and learning centre sector. That was a 62% increase in our funding. How about that? Yeah, it was an election year, but it wasn't just that. It was the government was now seeing us as a partner in community building. Not as someone they had made and asking for some money, but as a partner with whom they could do much better, without whom they would do much worse. I tell you, it was a great win, and Candy announced it at the conference, the ANLHC conference, and there was great excitement. But was it the end of the campaign? No, as I said before. We had 2 reports that we could now rely on for the future. The first was a Victorian Parliamentary report on interface communities, where, I don't know what you call them, growth communities perhaps, where neighbourhood houses were put into policy, or recommended to be put into policy, as central to community infrastructure in growth areas. So it gave us a base for a capital argument. Perhaps you'd like to ask David Capo to do a report, tell him Joan sent you, on the central importance of neighbourhood houses in community building. And then the Minister asked myself and my committee to write a social inclusion report. And exactly the same thing. We featured neighbourhood houses as central for community infrastructure. And now we drew up future opportunities for strengthening the sector so that we had something to look forward to. Things like involvement of neighbourhood houses in community planning. Do you local governments have a thing called a community plan? Yeah. How many of you have been part of that? Developing it? Few? Yeah? Crucial. Really crucial that you see that as one of your future opportunities, since even easier you've got some funding to do it. Second one was continuing to be seen as part of the continuing development of community infrastructure. The third one was building networks and partnerships so that it's not just constantly a grant mechanism which drives the batty after a while, but it is a partnership so that when you think of something you want to do, or government thinks of something it wants to do in community strengthening practice, then you can work as partners on agreed objectives. And the last one, and I think for me anyway, one of the most important ones, is to work on social inclusion. There are some neighbourhood houses in Victoria and maybe here who get into a comfort zone of working comfortably with the people who are like them and are uncomfortable with people from more disadvantaged backgrounds or maybe with disability or greater diversity, or cultural diversity. And I'm frankly disturbed when that happens, and it's my role as community ambassador to talk to people about how we might change that. It's only a small number of houses, But you can't go and ask government for more funds for neighbourhood houses, for networks and partnerships and community infrastructure and community planning, unless you've got that basic understanding of and commitment to equity and to change for those who are most disadvantaged. So the very empowerment that the people who you've got in your houses feel transfers to the people who don't have that advantage. As you can tell, I firmly believe that inclusive neighbourhood houses and learning centres are at the heart of building a functional link between community interaction and the generation of community infrastructure. And as I said, I'd like to see your Social Inclusion Board writing a report on just that. Maybe you could write to your Premier, and maybe I could too, and ask him to do just that. Because your value needs to be recognised before you can actually get the money. In South Australia, you now have the need and the experience to run your own version of the successful Victorian campaign. You need to pick up the motto of that age-old feminist song, "Don't be too polite, girls." After all, you're only asking for what is your right. That's all. It's not as though you're going with empty-handed. You're going with full hands in the excellent work you do. So don't be too polite, girls and boys, but don't be too strident either, because you're working in a political atmosphere which is easy to scare as well as easy to win. So I understand that from today's conference and from your board, you have the authority to run a good campaign, and a tough campaign, and a strategic campaign. All you need now is more people with your passion and drive welded into an effective lobbying action team. But above all, while you're doing it, keep your primary values in mind. I don't know why you're in community work, but I know why I am. And it might sound a very grandiose three little words, but they were taught to me by a wonderful woman from South Australia, or ex-South Australian, I don't know, she might be back now, Lillian Holt, who was principal of the first Aboriginal Community College in Adelaide. And her view of why she was in community action, and it is mine, is, Joan, I'm here to enhance humanity. That expression came about when I asked her, when I chaired the Centenary Federation Advisory Committee for Keating, when I asked her how she thought Indigenous people should celebrate Federation. It's a pretty silly question, really, but I had to ask her because I was a chair. Anyway, she smiled at me very nicely and said, "Oh, Joan, I think we should celebrate Federation by talking about racism." And I said, "Lillian, come off it. You can't have a celebration talking about racism." She said, "Yes, you can. Because in talking about racism in this country, you would achieve collective healing. And we could all learn as a result of it. It's not about being anti-white. It is about bringing pro-humanity. For what has diminished me as an Aboriginal woman in this country has diminished all Australians, both white and black. Our task, all of us, is to enhance humanity." Lillian was right, is right. Any community campaign, including strengthening neighbourhood houses, has to be based on working the members of your community to enhance humanity rather than diminish it. And I know that that's exactly what you do. Exactly what you do. Exactly why you're still passionate about it, as Heather said this afternoon. So, now it's time to turn that passion into political action. I know some of you think, well, we haven't got the time, it's not my gig. But if you give away the little bit of power that you have as a neighbourhood house, then you will never get it back. And you won't get the platform to move forward. If you bring the little bits of power that you all have together, you will have a whole battalion of powerful people to move forward. So, it's time to translate your community participation into community power and collective action. It's time to see yourself not just as a centre, but as a collective of action. And I'm sure if you do this, especially in the coming election year, you will win through. Don't tell Mike I sent you. Good luck.